So I think we're going to start with at least the very intro. The main panel discussion will be happening in a few minutes. And so in light of all the facts that the folks that are here, thank you so much for joining. I am Kay Mosier McDivitt, and I am with the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and I am a senior technical assistance specialist there, and I'm facilitating the overall webinar. And in a few minutes, then we'll be introducing you to all of our guest speakers that are joining. So thanks again for joining. I am going to now share my screen so that we can get started. Okay, so welcome to the second webinar in our series, Stronger Together, a Roadmap to an Effective Homeless System. A month ago, we had our first webinar, which was about outreach, and today's webinar is on targeted homeless prevention, stemming the inflow. A little bit about the National Alliance to End Homelessness. We are the leading national voice on ending homelessness. We have three areas that we work in. We have our research department, we have our policy department, and we have our capacity building department. And our goal is to identify, evaluate practices, and inform the field to continue our work forward to end homelessness across the country. So just before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. You will see these on the slides. I am not going to read them in depth. But what we want to make sure that on this webinar is that all diverse voices are included for facilitators, attendees, and guests in anything that we do. So right now in the forum, and all voices are welcome. We do have a zero tolerance policy for any form of discrimination or any abusive abusive behavior. And we're committed to ensuring that our events are safe and respectful for all of you. So throughout the webinar and the Q&A, just be aware of that. We want to make sure that we acknowledge any form of discrimination, violence, or abusive behavior, and that can result in removing you from the webinar if folks are not responding to our asking them to deter from some of the statements they may be making. And so, again, we want to just make sure that this is very diverse, inclusive for all of you, and that we're comfortable and that we can have a really robust Q&A and chat and learning experience through this webinar. So a couple of things, everything is in the Q&A box. So that's where a lot of times we're used to a Zoom meeting. This is a webinar via Zoom, which means we're using a Q&A box. And there will be some accompanying documents that will be posted on our website. The PowerPoint will be there, a recording will be there, and there will be a one-page. So a one-pager. So also, you know that the webinar is being recorded. I told you you'll see that posted. We're not doing any polls today, but we will at future webinars do some polls. And as I said, this is our webinar series, our Stronger Together. When we put the series together, our team got together and really talked about, we want to make sure that we're not just talking about interventions in separation from each other, but remembering that these interventions are all in a continuum. And we want to be working together on this continuum. And so the series is about all these interventions, how we intertwine, how we work together to be more effective. So today is the second one. You'll see it circled there, the targeted homeless prevention. And obviously you all register for that one. It's here. The registration is already open for the next session, which will be happening in a month on March 21st. And that's going to be on housing problem solving. So get in there, get registered so that you can be ready for that one. And we don't have the registration for the next one, but you can see the dates on the slides. So a little bit about why we're talking Stronger Together. So again, we want you to think about, as you're listening today, is like, how does targeted prevention impact your effectiveness and equitableness of the homeless response system, right? So we work as a system, and we're really wanting to make sure that we are communicating that folks are not, and I'm going to just recognize this because you all are hearing it, that the dog has decided to bark in the background. I will do my best to temper that. It is one of those things that we've learned from working from home, can sometimes do that. Let me see. Okay, I think we're good now. So I apologize for that. Okay, so the main goals of our system are, we want to, whenever possible, divert people from imminent homelessness, right? The front door. Folks coming in the front door, first-time homelessness, what can we do at that front door of homelessness? And then if we are not able to divert people from homelessness, if we're not able to prevent their homelessness, and folks do come into our system, then how do we house people as quickly as possible? So how do we think of the effectiveness of all these interventions? Again, your end game is that homelessness, you've heard this, throughout the years, homelessness is rare. If it does happen, it's brief. And it's one time. We don't have people coming in and out of the system. And so here's these 4 elements that every system should have. So we want to make sure that when people have a housing crisis, they know where to go to access help. Whether it's prevention resources, whether it's diversion, whether it's shelter, that there is access for folks to go. We want to also make sure that folks are unsheltered, that we don't have people living outside. And we know in the last point in time count that we are seeing numbers of unsheltered rise. And so we're really working and trying to help communities think through, how do we start looking at the whole system so we can really reduce the number of folks that are unsheltered. If folks are coming into homelessness, we want to reduce the amount of time people spend homeless. And then finally, we want to make sure that people are exiting the homeless system quickly and they do not come back into the homeless system. And so system performance measures, your SPMs, if the folks are on here that are the continuum of care leads, this is very familiar. Every year, continuums of care are submitting this information. If you get continuum of care funding specifically, and measurements of, what does first-time homelessness look like? And, over the years, you can see where you're headed with that. Where are our access to permanent housing? Are we seeing that we're increasing our access to permanent housing? Are we decreasing the average lengths of stay in our system? And then also looking at the returns to homelessness. So every time, whatever intervention we work in, whatever organization we work in, we need to think beyond our own programs and really think about, is our work having a system impact on all of these? Is the work that we're doing what we need it to do? And here's the system interventions. So we've already done the street outreach webinar. And so today we're doing the targeted prevention webinar. And then coming up is that, housing problem solving and diversion, coordinated entry, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, transitional housing. And that last slide is supposed to say permanent supportive housing. We will need to correct that before we send this out. But in all of it, everything we do should be rooted in the housing first philosophy, rooted in data driven, and rooted in equity, and all coordinated. So it's not enough to have the interventions. It's really important to make sure that we are rooting them in what's really important, which is housing first, being data driven, the equity across every single thing we're doing, and then being coordinated, not linear, but coordinated. So I like to use this, right? So thinking about, I live in Florida, and there's a lot of traffic circles. And right now we're in snowbird season. If you've not lived here, you don't know what that is, maybe, but it creates a huge amount of additional traffic. And we find that a lot of the folks have never been in a traffic circle or approached one. Typically, you get into a traffic circle, you just watch your traffic, you enter, you flow around. And actually, as much as people complain about them, studies show that traffic circles are the most efficient way for traffic flow. And they also make sure that you are not stopping traffic, and there's a lot less accidents, believe it or not. When folks are coming in and just stopping instead of flowing with traffic, what happens, right? The whole system backs up. So when one car, one element of a system of the traffic circle is not working, what that can do is really create the whole system backup. So really thinking about that. And then my colleague Josh put this together, and I love this, because if we're making a lot of investments and we're not really thinking about it, it's just like we make, shoot from the hip investments, something happens and we go, oh, we need to do this or we need to do this. What can happen is that we just look like a hot mess, this picture on the side, right? That everything's colliding, nothing's working together. Sometimes we open a lot of emergency shelters, but we don't think about how do people get out of shelter. So we get the shelter, but then there's no place for people to go. And so everything just sort of starts piling on top of each other. And on the right side, we have this really smooth picture of everything like working together smoothly. And we'd like to envision that and think, how do I, in the work I do, how does targeted prevention and how do all of these systems work together to make that happen? And so just a little bit to set the stage for targeted homeless prevention. And then I'm going to turn this over to Tom Albanese, who will be moderating our session today with the roundtable. All right, what are we talking about, right? What are we talking about when we talk about targeted prevention? We are talking about targeted assistance for folks most likely to become homeless, right? So we look at, and really this whole highlighted thing here based on local data, like what do people look like that come into our system? How are we making sure that when we use our prevention resources, we are targeting them to the most vulnerable folks that are most likely to enter our homeless system? And when we start doing that and using our prevention resources in a very targeted way, what we find is that we're decreasing that inflow. We decrease first-time homelessness, and we are helping those extremely vulnerable folks. So that first-time homelessness, that entry into the system, we're turning that faucet off as it comes into the system at the very beginning. So there's really two pillars when we talk about prevention. So we have the upstream prevention and eviction prevention and mainstream providers. And my colleague, Marcy Thompson, will talk about that later at the very end of the webinar, a little bit to think about that. But what is the homeless responses system? Those of us that work in this homeless response system, which is our pillar. And our pillar is that targeted prevention and diversion. So I'm going to circle that. So that's where we are today, right? We are looking at the piece that we are responsible for, the upstream work. There's a lot of people that need to be doing that work, but today and our work is on this targeted prevention and diversion. So this is just a little silly picture here that I often use, but this is our system right now, right? Like people keep coming into our system and we're bailing out, we're housing people as quickly as we can. And what we've done a lot in a lot of communities, when I used to run my continuum care, we were looking at the exits, right? We just kept looking at getting people out. And we were not paying attention to that faucet, right? And we realized that we're going to have to start turning that faucet back, because no matter how much we were bailing out, if that faucet is like dumping more water in than what we have resources to provide, what we're going to end up is down here in all this overflowing tub. That's why we have shelter wait lists, right? And that's why we have like really a lot of unsheltered folks. So just really remembering that this is about that faucet knowing that we're turning that inflow faucet back. And then finally, what is the desired impact? The work when you hear the folks talk today about the work that they're doing in their communities around targeted prevention, this is what the goal is that we want to see decreased numbers of first-time homeless, right? So it's not just what your program numbers look like. What is happening to our system? I always say one of the best ways to evaluate whether we're effectively targeting our prevention resources is to look and say, are we seeing a difference in our system? Not just our program. Oh, well, we provided, this assistance for this many people, and this many people didn't become homeless. But if there's still a ton of people becoming homeless, maybe we need to back it up a little bit more and start looking more at the people that are becoming homeless. Because if we do that, then hopefully the goal is that we're going to decrease the number of people living unsheltered. We're also going to decrease the number of people entering shelter, and then we're going to decrease the number of people on the shelter waiting list. So at this point, we have an amazing panel. Tom Albanese is going to be moderating the panel. I am going to turn this over to Tom, and he's going to talk a little bit, and then he will have the panelists start talking. I'm going to recognize again that there's been this horrible yelp in the background. We've done multiple things. It hasn't changed it, but now I'm going to go on mute so you won't need to hear that going on anymore. So Tom, it's all yours. And just tell me when to forward the slides, Tom.
Okay, will do. Thanks, Kay. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining today. I'm really excited to be here. Tom Albanese, my pronouns are he, him. I'm based in Columbus, Ohio, and as Kay said, I've been doing this a minute, along with Kay and Marcy and others here. We've been working on targeted prevention now for a couple decades, and longer than that even. I've actually had the great honor of being in this field for more than 30 years and started my career in a rural community, running a small shelter where prevention was the imperative, because of the limited resources and shelter capacity that we had. We're going to talk about that today, how the necessity to be smart with our resources, to be targeted with our resources, to make sure we're getting to the right people at the right time with the right assistance, how that is really a driving force in our entire field. And it's really done a lot to help us refine and focus our resources to make sure we're lifting up people who need help and using resources to promote equity, most of all. There's a couple of key concepts that I do want to talk about to add to what Kay said as far as some background ideas. And just by way of simplicity's sake, we often talk about efficiency and effectiveness and equity. When we're talking about targeted prevention, these concepts are material. They really matter, and they're central to this work, really beginning with the idea of efficiency. And this is work that a lot of folks have looked at over the years, including folks like Marty Burt and others who've done some deep work to look at prevention programs and whether or not they're effective in getting to the right people. And generally what research has shown is that non-targeted prevention programs that just take the next person in line, let's say eviction prevention programs, tend to have very little effect on rates of literal homelessness, because we simply aren't getting to the folks who are becoming literally homeless when we're just doing next come models and non-targeted models. So being efficient, making sure we're getting to the right people by way of screening and other strategies we're going to hear about today is really central. And then, of course, being effective in our services and making sure we're providing the right amount and intensity of service. We'll hear about that in a moment as well. Ultimately, to lift up and ensure that our resources are being used in the most equitable way possible and based on evidence-based approaches. So those are really central to the work around targeted prevention. If you go to the next slide, what we mean by targeted prevention is really quite simple. It's a type of prevention that is targeted to people who are most likely to experience, in this case, the worst form of housing insecurity, which is literal homelessness. So when we're talking about a social concept like housing insecurity and trying to target resources to have a greater impact and to better prevent housing insecurity, and mostly the worst form of housing insecurity, that's when we start to get into targeted prevention and diversion, frankly, because diversion might be thought of as the most targeted form of prevention, where you're doing this with folks who are presenting for shelter, seeking emergency help right now, and trying to quote unquote divert them from emergency shelter and falling into literal homelessness or regaining housing. So these are really essential concepts. And I'll add one other, which is a notion that HUD has been really emphasizing, and I think it sort of captures the essence of why targeted prevention is important, because it lifts up all boats. The idea is targeted universalism. When we target our resources to people who have the greatest barriers and the most significant vulnerabilities, the impact of that tends to ripple and have benefits to everyone. And so targeted universalism is a concept that we talk about in the prevention space because it helps us better understand why we target resources and the broader impact of that. And I'll just add lastly that there are federal programs, the Federal Emergency Solutions Grants Program, the Supportive Services for Veteran Families Program, that fund targeted prevention. And if you have any programs in your community, which you definitely have a Supportive Services for Veteran Families Program in your community, because they're in virtually every community in the US. And you may have an ESG funded prevention program. If you have those programs, then you already have targeted prevention programs funded in your community, because those programs by definition only serve people who are most at risk and imminently going to experience literal homelessness. If you go to the next slide, just briefly, some of us on this panel are working on coordinated prevention. I'll introduce our panelists here in a second. Coordinated prevention is a way of putting all the pieces together in communities, starting with our most basic forms of prevention services, but then tying them and coupling them to more targeted forms of prevention that we're going to be talking about today that get at people who are most likely to experience literal homelessness. But these things are also connected to the front door of our homeless crisis response systems. We find that, communities that start to get into targeted prevention tend to start to develop new partnerships with partners and neighborhood organizations that perhaps haven't been part of our homeless crisis response system before. And this is how we start to connect our crisis response to community-based responses. And we start to create what I like to simply call an urgent care model of housing crisis response, where it's not the emergency room and it's not upstream, but we're meeting people a few steps up the walkway from the emergency room when they're still in a heightened state of urgent need, but they're not yet today in need of shelter. And that's where we come to targeted prevention. So if you go to the next slide, in Columbus, I've had the great honor of working in the Columbus system for many years on and off at the Community Shelter Board, in addition to doing consulting around the country, and working with the community today in Columbus to stand up what we call locally the Homelessness Prevention Network. This was started a few years back with demonstration funding from the Nationwide Foundation that allowed us to staff system lead, homelessness program, homelessness prevention network manager, who went about starting to develop partnerships. And we spent 3 years sort of road testing a model of standardized screening using a standardized risk typology with a broad set of diverse partners. And today, the city of Columbus has invested in this demonstration to scale it with now 28 diverse agencies who are trained in housing problem solving, who are using standardized risk screener tools and providing urgent housing intervention for people who are not yet presenting to the emergency shelter system, but are within a few days of presenting. And we've targeted those resources and those providers in areas and specific zip codes where there's the highest need. As Kay said earlier, all of the development in Columbus is data-driven. So we've used our shelter intake data to examine the characteristics of people coming into shelter, where they're living, the zip codes they were living in last, the demographic makeup of people experiencing homelessness. We've also looked at other indicators that suggest higher housing insecurity to come up with a heat map. So we can identify in our community where there's the greatest housing insecurity and the greatest need for partnerships and concentrated resources. And the city of Columbus is calling this infrastructure and is starting to invest in this, understanding the importance of having frontline staff who are trained to engage people experiencing a housing emergency who are not yet in need of shelter. So that's what's happening in Columbus, just a little flavor of our targeted work. But I want to pass it now to our panelists and really hear from the great work that's happening around the country. What I'd like to do is ask each of our panelists, some of whom I know and some of whom I've just met, to just introduce yourself. So I'm just going to do kind of a round robin, and I'll call on our panelists quickly to just say a few words about your background, your current role, and a little bit about your work professionally, you and your role, but also just organizationally, the organization you work with. related to prevention. Just a few minutes of background. So Dana, can I start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. I'm excited to be here today. My name is Dana Vanderford. I'm the Associate Director of Homelessness Prevention for LA County's Department of Health Services. I currently lead the work of the Homelessness Prevention Unit. We're a newer program under the Department of Health Services. We are a proactive, very targeted prevention program working pretty far upstream to identify clients who we believe are most at risk of losing their housing in the next 12 months, both single adults and individuals. We run a predictive model on county info hub data that collects data about county service utilization across 9 different county departments, including the Department of Health Services, Department of Mental Health, Sheriff's Department, DPSS, to produce a high risk list of clients who we then cold call. When we do reach those folks, we offer them an intervention that is pretty short term, but very intensive. So 4 months of case management support, very flexible financial assistance at a pretty significant level, and linkages to supportive services. So our clients are folks who are using the emergency room frequently, receiving crisis stabilization holds for their mental health frequently, receiving benefits, experiencing frequent arrests. So they're high utilizers of county services and systems. Right now we have scaled up to serve around 250 clients at any given time. We're a new program, so still figuring out how effective our intervention is, but hopefully by 2026, we'll really know how effective this model of targeted prevention is. Our goal is to stabilize folks in their existing housing and ultimately and long-term prevent folks from entering into the homeless services system. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Dana. Stephanie, would you like to go next?
Good afternoon, Stephanie Hawthorne, she, her, hers pronouns. I am working in DC. I'm the Homelessness Prevention Program Director for Community of Hope. In DC, we are one of 4 providers of targeted homelessness prevention. In DC, we work with families only at this time. And then in DC, the families that we are working with and seeing are those families who are reaching out to our coordinated entry system point, seeking actual shelter. And so for those families, diversion efforts take place at the front door. And for the families that have at least one night to stay somewhere, those families are then sent to the prevention programs. And we work to stabilize those families in their current living situation, in their communities. And then we provide extensive case management to reduce the barriers to housing that the families are experiencing. And so our program is 120 days at any given time, but there is no limit to the amount of time that families can come and receive assistance in DC.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. Masita, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. My name is Masita Dorley. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as Black, and I am a senior associate currently with Technical Assistance Collaborative. We're not a direct service organization, but more so support the work of service providers. And so my focus in this area is ensuring that these programs such as this or initiatives such as this is integrated within the system, homeless response system process, specifically with rural communities, which is a large focus of mine because of the fact that rural communities are already at a disadvantage dealing with limited resources and the large geographical landscape that they have to cover. This is a great approach to incorporate within programs. And so I go around helping to kind of infuse that process within their homeless response system. So.
Thank you, Masita. Jamie, would you like to go next?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jamie Hummer. I'm the program director at Strategies to End Homelessness in Cincinnati. We're the lead agency in Cincinnati, Hamilton County. I oversee our cross-community programs, including a shelter diversion program, which is one of the reasons I was asked to speak, as well as another program for today's purposes, a newer targeted prevention program. So the shelter diversion program, we serve around 250 households, families, and individuals who are calling our hotline for shelter, and we're able to divert those folks, and we're able to offer short-term rental assistance to stabilize those households and avoid that shelter stay. And also we're working with Tom and some folks in developing a new coordinated targeted prevention program that I'd love to talk to you guys about.
Thank you, Jamie. And last but not least, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Pavone, Director of Strategy with Journey Home. We are also not a direct service provider. We are the backbone agency in overseeing the homeless service system for 2 regions in Connecticut. Me and my team oversee all of coordinated entry, which consists of diversion and prevention. Specifically in Hartford, Connecticut, we are focusing and leading in partnership with Community Solutions, a coordinated prevention model to try to coordinate all of our existing resources to have a more targeted response in reducing inflow into the homeless service system.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all again just for taking the time today, panelists and everyone who's here. We have over 1,000 folks with us today, which is really exciting. You know, there's a lot of interest in prevention around the country. And I'll just say before we dive into some questions and hearing more from our communities, that this is a longstanding question nationally for us, is how to best target these resources. It's been a challenge. And there's been a lot of reservation about putting money into prevention when we aren't sure we're getting to the right people. So with that in mind, like, this is all about getting to the right people and making sure we're demonstrating that when we have resources for prevention, we can make the best use of them. So I want to start off with Stephanie and just sort of ask you, if you don't mind, Stephanie, I'll put you on the spot to begin with, and ask about how you're identifying families who are highest risk. And if you could just talk a little bit about how DC, maybe the rationale why DC has really emphasized sort of targeted prevention at your front door for families who are being diverted, and how that has sort of made sense to you as a way to target resources. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So DC is first and foremost one of the few places that has a right to shelter for families, for the family system. So when families are coming seeking shelter, the sooner prevention can get involved, the better, because we find families that are coming in, and while they have a limited amount of time before they enter shelter, we want to catch them then. And then it gives the prevention program time to work through those resources for those families and allow them to stay in the community a little bit longer, so that we do have time to stabilize and look for housing options, as well as addressing some of the barriers to housing that the families have been a part of. So the front door really, it's the best place to catch people. If they're coming literally to ask for shelter, that's the place you want to catch them before they actually enter. So we have found that we are serving those families that are at highest risk, and we are catching them before they actually have to enter a shelter system.
Stephanie, just a quick follow-up. What, if you know off the top of your head, great. If you don't, I'm not putting you on the spot, but what sort of success rates are you getting with your diversion and targeted prevention?
So over the past 4 to 5 years, DC has seen a decrease in homelessness consistently over that time. And then for our the prevention programs, we are seeing great rates of families not having to enter shelter. During last year, 2023, we saw 96% of families that did not have to enter shelter. Of course, there are going to be families that will have to enter, but it's a risk that you have to take, and you have to catch them early on, even if those are the families that are that close to going to shelter, and then you try, and then if you're able to succeed, and we've seen good success with it at the front door.
Great point. And I think I've heard folks say, you know, if you're not failing, you're not getting to the right people,
Yeah.
because you're not going to succeed all the time. Sarah, can I put you on the spot and ask you to just speak a little bit to how Hartford has approached targeting, and really kind of starting with how you've used data to kind of drive some of your decision making in targeting, how that informed your initial work?
Yeah, definitely. So we targeted our prevention efforts based on geography and subpopulation based on data. And when I say we, like, Community Solutions really led this work in Hartford, specifically like Nadia Lugo, before they approached Journey Home to have a local lead move this work forward. But for geographic targeting, we use geomapping for poverty rates, crime rates, housing code violations, and eviction rates. So we used data that was available through public sources such as judicial websites, municipal databases, as well as the census. Then with all of that data, utilized GIS, or Geographic Information System mapping, and overlaid all of the data, which led us to focus on 2 specific zip codes within the city of Hartford. For subpopulation focus, we looked at our inflow data from our HMIS system. So we looked at a year of data, analyzed the data, and then couple that with qualitative interviews of individuals who experienced homelessness for the same year that the inflow data was pulled. And this led to a subpopulation target of individual Black men, average age in their early to mid 40s, with a history of disconnection to behavioral health services, discharging from Department of Corrections, as well as formal and informal evictions. So folks that left their apartment prior to formal court proceedings, or that like couch surfing doubled up population.
Thank you, Sarah, for that. It's just a fascinating, I think, example of how your data maybe led you to a place you didn't expect, perhaps, but has really been a big driver for your work. Jamie, can you speak a little bit to how Cincinnati is doing kind of similar work in terms of starting your, you've been doing a lot of prevention work for a long time, but just your more recent work, how you've used data to kind of focus in on certain areas?
Yeah. As Sarah's talking, I'm like, man, we sounds just like us. So yeah, what we did a mix of quantitative, qualitative data analysis as well. And we started with a similar inflow analysis. I would say the biggest piece of data that we looked at was just the number of folks coming into our homelessness system, broken out by first-time homeless and returning folks to the system. And we realized, so we started with that detailed inflow analysis, looking at the areas of town that people are coming into the system, where they're coming from. And in that analysis, one of the most striking things we saw was immediately that the highest rate of, like, we looked at zip codes specifically, and we noticed that one zip code, or a few of the same area zip code, was by far the highest, and it was an area of town called Westwood. So if you're familiar with Cincinnati, it's on the west side. Westwood, they're actually the largest neighborhood, both by geography and population in Cincinnati. So at first glance, that doesn't really surprise you. We might have easily brushed it off, like, well, it's the largest. That makes sense that it's also the largest in our homelessness data. However, we realized, like, when sitting in that room, looking at the data, probably 80 years of experience in this work between all of us, and not one of us could name a single partner in the Westwood area that's doing this work, or doing prevention work, or anything to do with homelessness. So we knew that there is some kind of disconnect there we needed to fix, and it also was a great opportunity an incredible opportunity to make a big impact in our homeless data, if we can just figure out how to stem the inflow from that one area.
That's great. And, Jamie, can I do a quick follow-up with you? You all did a little bit of light qualitative data gathering too. Can you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, so like around the same time we were doing the data analysis, we also asked a handful of folks with lived experience to share their stories in depth. And I think maybe one or two of them are on this call. So thank you all if you are here, to helping inform the work. And it was so getting that perspective is always so important, but it also is just so illuminating to this work to show like how chaotic it is to get services and to navigate the system, and yeah, just that that qualitative information really has driven everything that we do, and it informs literally every step of our process.
Thank you, Jamie. Masita, can you speak to that a little bit too? I'm gonna punt to you and maybe talk a little bit about, you and I have some similar background working in rural communities, and we were talking a little bit about that just preparing for this session. And I think there's different dynamics in rural communities that are really important when we're talking about prevention and making sure we're not just getting to the right people, but using the limited resources we have wisely. I think everything we do in kind of a rural setting relies on qualitative assessment that we're doing all the time, because that's really all we got. But can you speak to that a little bit in rural settings where resources are thinner? What does that look like as far as trying to stand up targeted prevention in settings where maybe everyone looks like they're in an equal state of crisis? What does that look like, your experience?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think, to your point, when you have areas, right, that covers such a large geographical landscape that may have limited resources, whether it's a provider desert, whether it's lacking transportation, communities, I think, want to be a little bit innovative and lean in a more non-traditional aspect, and really lean in maybe to the support of non-traditional partners in rural communities, so then that they, as you collect the data that may identify individuals and or households that are at risk, you're able to create this network of system to be able to support um, ensuring that they don't enter into the system. So it's really important, because non-traditional partners can provide another means for support to individuals and families at risk and or who are experiencing homelessness, particularly those who may not have access, right, to fewer mainstream organizations. So, if your organization or provider, the first thing is to try to perhaps create an ongoing database of your non-traditional partners in your community for cross-system collaboration, that may vary regarding county, regarding different locations, because we know in communities, you can have a county that has, what you see historically is they may have one or two large cities and then smaller towns that surround that cities that historically everybody has to drive to that town. But if there's a way to identify who's doing some sort of support within communities that may border the large cities in the county, then you're able to expand that outreach to individuals who may be at risk and are in need of targeted prevention services. So I would say identifying non-traditional partners in the community for cross-system collaborations, whether they may be from social clubs, they're from the faith communities, they're from local community college, they're from advocacy organizations, and kind of having an ongoing database that you are able to pull from. And then once you're able to do that, identifying those non-traditional partners that can also help identify those individuals and families that are at risk, you're able to then maybe perhaps see how you're able to leverage available funding streams to support the services that may be needed to prevent folks from entering into the system. For example, how can you explore financial collaborations with community-based agencies that some, provide healthcare, they provide childcare, they provide transportation service, they provide, different services that housing, the loss of housing is the end result of various components within the household, right? That really keeps bottling up. So how you're able to kind of maybe tap into those other agencies that you may not think have a small funding stream that could help, but they may have a supplemental income that can be able to help that household. And then finally, perhaps establishing a stabilization of services, for families who are at risk, especially in rural communities. Sometimes they're in isolated areas. So in order to establish a stabilization of services and support, perhaps creating opportunities for family to develop social connections, developing and kind of facilitating groups, that are really sensitive to the unique needs of families experiencing homelessness to really help mitigate the risk of social isolation. And that's where, again, you're able to pull from your churches, your faith-based organizations, your temples, your other places of worship who really sometimes serve as a non-traditional front door for families and individuals facing homelessness and could be a really free resources, right? Because they're always mission driven that you're able to pull in, especially if you're an organization that has low capacity and staff members that you can really leverage and lean on to be able to support those individuals or families that are at imminent risk, but may need a stronger kind of a system of support and network to prevent entering into the system.
Such a host of great points, Missy. That like what comes to mind is it takes a village. Like and in rural cities, like it truly does. I don't mean to say that like tongue in cheek. It really does. And you made a point I want to come back to and then punt over to Dana, because I think it's really important when we're talking about targeting, and this seems almost counterintuitive. We have to cast the widest net possible. And we need to make sure everybody who's agreeing to be part of that net is using the same couple questions. It's basic screening. And our healthcare friends know this really well because they're doing social determinant screening, right? And our healthcare friends here, I'm sure, can reflect and speak to that. But this is about identifying people who may not be raising their hand today or calling your homeless hotline today, who nonetheless only have a matter of days, perhaps a week or two, before they will be calling your homeless hotline or sleeping in their car or somewhere unsafe. And this is the point of targeting, is also getting to people before, as much as we're able, before that most severe point of crisis, when there's almost no opportunity to do anything but offer shelter. And even the best, and I appreciate Stephanie, I'm going to come back to you here in a few minutes, but even the best diversion programs can catch people at that 11th hour. And so that's why targeting and getting to folks before they're showing up, perhaps maybe at the 10th hour, we can catch them, is what we're attempting to do. But Dana, can you speak to LA is doing, the health department and the work you and your team are doing is really amazing, because you're starting to use data that is can help us better identify people who, because of a variety of factors, have indicated risk, and there's trigger points that you mentioned that are causing someone to do a cold call. So can you talk a little bit, and I see a question in our chat too, and we're going to get to the questions here in the Q&A, but some of the factors that you all use to kind of determine a higher risk, and then if you can also just speak to a little bit of what does that cold call look like? Who does it? How does that how does that happen? How fast does that happen? So a little bit of that too.
Yeah, we're really lucky to be well resourced in the ways that we are here in LA County, despite a lot of the challenges that we face too around housing scarcity and the number of folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness on any given night, there's a couple ways in which we're lucky. One is we have this reservoir of data that county departments feed into that we can run a predictive model on. So we take actually over 400 different factors into account in our model that runs on millions of records of county service utilization data, including, as I mentioned earlier, who's visiting the ER frequently, who is receiving crisis stabilization holds for their mental health frequently, interacting with the sheriff's department, receiving public benefits. Our partners at UCLA built and tested this model several years ago, sort of on the hunch that the folks who are most likely to fall into homelessness in the next 12 months are likely interacting with the county in some form or fashion already, and saw that we could, with a high degree of accuracy, predict who was most likely to start touching the homeless services system in the next 12 months. Years down the road, we built up a unit kind of based on our ability to predict, to then start reaching out to not only predict, but then prevent spells of homelessness in the lives of those folks. And the cold calling process is really interesting. So we receive a list of a couple hundred folks on an ad hoc basis, depending on our unit's capacity. We do a little bit of eligibility testing at the front door of our unit, essentially just to determine that somebody still is in some form of housing to the best of our ability to tell. And then we start picking up the phone. Getting in touch with people is really challenging. I mean, cold calling on its own is always pretty interesting. But we lose about 75% of our prospective clients because we can't get in touch with them. And this is, again, despite having access to so much great administrative data. Phone numbers don't work, phones go off. Clients are skeptical of our program. Understandably, we're calling out of the blue, and so voicemails don't get returned. The 25% of folks who we do reach, we have great success in encouraging those folks to enroll in our program. There's some magic to it that I'm sure is better explained by data, but feels like magic to me, where we seem to find people at moments of real crisis. They're losing their housing next week. And thank goodness that we called today, because they were out of family support and out of funds and out of other options. And so our ability to sort of appear out of nowhere and connect with folks at those really critical moments feels really magical to me. And so we get, less often than I thought we would, get hung up on, or questions like, how did you come to find me in the first place? And more often we get the response of like, I'm really glad you called today because I didn't know what I was going to do in 2 weeks. And I just wanted to say one other thing about the sort of raising your hand concept, if I could. We're also lucky in LA County that we've had prevention programs for years. Those are programs that people can reach out to, call, an advocate can call on their behalf if they know that they are getting evicted or that eviction is imminent. Those are the people who will raise their hand, know how to access those resources and know how to sort of navigate themselves to those resources. When you look at the population that our program serves compared to the population of our more referral-based prevention programming in LA County, there's virtually no overlap between those two populations served, which I think is incredible. So I think what we know is that we are reaching a specific population of people who, for one reason or another, because of acuity, because of lack of access, because of complicated, pathways to these resources, are unlikely to engage in the more referral-based prevention programming in our jurisdiction. And so I think we're just lucky to have two kinds of prevention programs here in LA County that serve two different populations, both who need these resources.
Yeah, I think that's a really good call out, Dana. And there's an interesting point there, I think, around housing situations that we find people in who fall into literal homelessness for the first time. And oftentimes they're doubled up situations and shared housing situations of different variety, right? And so that's where I think there's some value in, these non-traditional, as you put it, Masita, partners and ways to maybe ask everybody showing up at the pantry or the pantry network within your community if they're worried about their housing tonight. And I wonder if, Jamie, can I just come back to you for a second? I saw just yesterday data that you all had looked at from the Westwood neighborhoods that you're starting to zero in on around those living situations. I don't know if you have it handy at the moment, but it's a really important point, I think, for everyone to consider, is the living situations of people the night before they come into shelter or outside or somewhere unsafe. And more often than not, the majority of those households are in doubled up situations and they're not renters, right? So it's thinking about that. But Jamie, do you happen to have that data handy? I'm kind of curious.
I don't have it in front of me, but that is something that like in our newer work with you all, Tom, and also, but we also use that same kind of concept in our much more established diversion program that we've had since 2013. We wanted to make sure even back then, way back when, that we were targeting people who would in fact be homeless, and your brain goes to somebody who's being evicted, like, well, their next step is going to be shelter, that makes sense. But what we saw and all the data that we looked at, and this 2013, but then also our data analysts that pulled 2023 numbers showed the same thing, that the vast majority of people coming into our homeless system, into shelters or ending up on the streets, they were not evicted. They weren't in their own housing and evicted. They were doubled up. So that's key to any of our prevention work. Is this is not eviction prevention. This is looking at folks who are doubled up, and ultimately they've been on mom's couch, on friend's couch, on uncle's couch, like friend to friend to friend, and they are on their absolute last couch, and determining, is this your last couch or is it your second to last couch? That's the challenge. But but the data has continually showed that folks doubled up, or the second one is also like in a hotel motel, but our data just consistently points to needing to focus on folks who are literally who are doubled up, and those are the folks who ultimately will be walking into shelter tomorrow.
And it's difficult, I think, when you get to those situations, to slow them down and to try to change that momentum off the cliff. I'm wondering, Stephanie, if I can turn it back to you for a second, just to speak to that, because you were given, how you kind of position your targeted prevention kind of right at the front door. You're really getting folks in kind of that last moment of opportunity. Can you speak to like what that looks like in terms of the readiness you have to have, the types of services you have to be ready to offer? And also, we had a question in the Q&A here to just speak a little bit to the difference between diversion versus targeted prevention, and where that line is, if there is a line.
Okay, so like a lot of the other speakers was talking about, for our program with prevention, about 78% of the families that are in the prevention programs are those who are in doubled up housing situations. So of course, when they come to the prevention front, we have to be ready to go to try to stabilize them where they already are. So with the question that was talking about targeted prevention and diversion, one of the first points of reference for case managers in our prevention programs is diversion. It's kind of figuring out who has been this family's support network up until this point, and reaching out to those family members and friends so that we can try to stabilize that family in their community for a little while longer, while we attempt to address barriers. One of the other very important things that I've heard on here today is having those resources and those networks of community resources available. That is so important for our families who are coming. They may have 5 or 10 days to stay somewhere, and then we're dealing with families who have history of barriers that cannot be resolved in 10 days, but we can get started on them. And so we definitely reach out to resources. So if one of the barriers to a family's housing is employment or education or daycare, or a host of different things come up, just having those resources available, or finding those resources within the community to connect those families to, is what we rely on heavily initially coming into the program.
That point, Stephanie, I just want to really underline it. I've heard this so many different ways from communities, is the the role of targeted prevention oftentimes is to bring resources to the situation of all variety. And I just love that point that you made. And it reminded me of one of our settlement houses here in Columbus who piloted our targeted prevention, and they offer like senior programs and childcare and pantry and emergency. They do everything because they are the go-to in their neighborhood, which is the most housing insecure neighborhood in our community. And what they realized for some households, when we gave them training on housing problem solving, they were able to access their senior services for one situation that slowed it down. Their senior daycare services, childcare services worked in one other situation. It's to your point, it's about marshaling community resources and creating, and we're all going to know this terminology, coordinated, prioritized access to existing resources. And to the extent we can get new resources, that's gravy. But let's use our existing resources in a smarter, more targeted way. And that's really what our communities here are doing. I wonder if, Masita, you can talk a little bit more about any communities you're seeing kind of in rural settings, or any tribal communities, perhaps, if you're working with any who are doing targeted work with their prevention resources. You spoke earlier about the non-traditional resources, and I'm curious if you have seen any examples of that, of folks who are doing this with prioritizing their existing resources.
Yeah, because when folks hear that, I imagine some folks are listening and say, well, that sounds all great, but what if I'm an organization that has 3 staff members? How do I do my work? How do my team does the case management, do all this, and also make that resource kind of an ongoing, live and up to date, right? Database that we're readily able to pull from, because to Stephanie's points, time is always of the essence when you're looking to help these help individuals and households. And one of the key strategies is and with what you said, Tom, of maximizing first internally within the organization, and what we share with communities, what you have. What are the 1, 2, 3 priorities that your staff needs to focus on, and then creating the other areas of role description that maybe you can leverage for outside volunteers, that maybe you can leverage in using a community college or a college that has a senior that is in need of a graduate program that can go and be the project manager or project coordinator. One community call it a resource specialist, to maintain that database. And what they did was they created the role description. And they utilized their local community college and faith-based organizations who were seeking volunteer opportunities, and also retirement folks who were seeking volunteer opportunities, and created this robust resource database that is now an ongoing, just a simple spreadsheet, but it's a shared spreadsheet that all of their participating provider network has access to. And that one, I think it's 3 individuals that does the cold calls to these resources that are available on a monthly basis, to be able to confirm that, yes, this is still available, this is still the access point, this is still the contact person for the individuals to be able to tap into. And so they just created this kind of little internal incubator where they had volunteers to project coordinate a resource database that is, it's cost effective. You don't have to spend funds on it. You can leverage those who are looking for senior projects to manage that, and really then pivot your staff to handle the more urgent needs of your households that you're serving. So that's one way.
Great examples. Thank you, Masita. Sarah, can you speak a little bit to some of the work that's happening now in Hartford, building on the work you've done in the targeted zip codes, to kind of build on that learning and how you've executed your targeting approaches? I'm wondering if you can just speak to the kind of what's on the horizon in Hartford. And then along with that, there was a question around how state agencies are getting involved, to what extent. I think Connecticut's probably ahead of the curve there. Can you speak to that as well?
Yeah, definitely. So to go to follow from Masita too, resource mapping for the zip codes has been really important, but not just with services, but with actual funding sources. So Tom, like I know you mentioned ESG and SSVF, but at least in our community, prevention efforts are heavily funded by philanthropy. So what we've done is really engage our large philanthropic donors to see who they are supporting, that lists any type of prevention efforts, and we put together a funder like toolkit to engage those donors as well as traditional funders to like show the benefit of asking their grantees to coordinate having like targeted prevention efforts, because I think we all know that utilization and like maximization of existing resources with that shared vision and shared definition that you've been talking about, Tom, for targeted prevention is going to have the highest impact on stemming the inflow into homelessness. And because we know we're not getting a ton of new resources, I will say like state departments are excited about our work because it's like, yeah, we actually don't have that much more to invest. COVID dollars are gone, ARPA dollars are about to be gone. They're not going to be reliable after the next 18 months or so. And we don't know what might be coming down the pike. So how do we utilize what we already have? And it really is that relationship building and getting municipal and state departments and state advocacy efforts behind doing what we already know works for ending homelessness. Like we know coordinated entry, collective impact. We have this coordinated response system for homelessness. Now, how do we actually move that upstream for our prevention efforts with all of those non-traditional partners we've been talking about, with our childcare and rental assistance and case management and healthcare, to really have a coordinated social safety network for our community.
And I think that gets a little bit to what's happening in LA. Dana, if I could just turn it back to you quickly. I think did you say 400 factors are going into your algorithm, which is just incredible. Can you speak to just a few of like what are some of the more important elements to your predictive model? And then secondly, I was curious if you can speak to some of the next step supports that are available to households who are cold called when it's discerned that there's a greater urgency to the situation that might merit more intensive involvement. Is there a connection, I guess, what I'm asking, to other next step prevention services?
Yeah. I think our most weighted, most significant factors that go into the model include those kind of service utilization data points around how frequently somebody is having crisis level interactions with county services and systems, including those ER visits, frequent interactions with the Department of Mental Health. I will say one thing that we found interesting when we started the work of the unit and tested the model again years down the road, we started seeing folks who had already fallen into the homeless services system by the time we were looking at them. We added a factor into the model to look at very recent interaction or application for public benefits. And that's when we started getting a list of folks who were reliably not in the homeless services system already, still appeared to be in housing. And so that was kind of a breakthrough for us on our end that we weren't expecting. And again, I couldn't explain it. We'll have evaluation results in a few years. But I do think that there's something there that a key factor to identify somebody who's right on the edge is that they've recently applied for public benefits. That could include, CalFresh or GR or SSI. So there's a tipping point there that we were able to identify when we went back to test the model. To your second question, Tom, we're a time limited program. We do have a significant amount of financial assistance available for our participants, but everybody with our program gets at least $4,000. We've gone up to right under $20,000 for one of the larger families that we've worked with. But that level of financial assistance and 4 months of case management is not often enough to change the trajectory of a single adult's life or a family's life who have a lot of barriers and a lot of vulnerabilities. So we are always reaching out to partnering programs. I mean, we're a group of generalists. We kind of help folks navigate complicated systems so that they can get linked to that ongoing benefit, sometimes to a subsidy, to a mental health provider that they love, to a statewide rental assistance program for the $30,000 in back pay that they've accrued over the last couple of years. There is really only so much that our program can do. I think we understand our limitations really well. And so just like others today have shared, we rely heavily on other programs in our community to help sustain care for our participants moving forward. And I do think it really comes down to also making sure that our participants know where to turn in the future should they find themselves in another moment of crisis. And that is a huge focus for our unit. This year, we survey our clients when they leave our program and we ask, do you know where you'd turn if you found yourself in a housing crisis again? And I think we want our responses there to be better. We want our clients to be able to have the knowledge and the experience to navigate these systems on their own next time. So that, we won't be needed and they'll be able to access the robust network of resources that does exist in LA County to support our residents.
Dana, I think this point about, what are we accomplishing when we're offering a targeted prevention intervention and how long is the effect of that, right? And I think we should be careful. I've, thought a lot about evaluation in this space and just generally have to be careful about how long we should expect a short-term intervention to last. Right. And the importance, as you said, Dana, of building bridges to other services and partners who are going to be there beyond the time somebody might be involved with the crisis response system. And that's where I think we have opportunity to build, again, a broader, more full ecosystem of crisis response services that are configured together and coordinated. So no matter where somebody shows up, they have equal and equitable access to assistance that can help them avoid the housing crisis and literal homelessness. And that's really the essence of our webinar. I know we're getting to a point where we need to start to wrap up, and Kay and Marcy are going to pick up and take us to the end. But before we pass it off to hear a few words from Marcy, just want to ask our panelists if there's any final words you'd like to share with the group, and particularly around lessons learned as you've worked to implement targeted prevention approaches. If there's any one or two kind of ahas or things that folks should think about or consider as they're moving forward, would love to just hear a quick word of wisdom. Jamie, any thoughts? Start with you.
I think the thing for us is just creativity, like thinking out of the box, thinking about how to approach old problems in a new way. We've had our diversion program since 2013, but the program today is nothing like it was in 2013 for a number of reasons, but you just have to be agile. Looking at, there's a lot of questions in the chat, but it's like a lot of questions around funding structure, and even that looks like what it looks like today is so different from what it looked like 10 years ago. And so just having to be agile in finding those funding streams that may fit in this space and going after those, and maybe even tweaking your program itself to fit into where the funding is. We're doing a lot of that right now, especially with the COVID funding. We had buckets of money to spend, and now I think a lot of us are seeing that cliff come up more quickly than we hoped. So just finding ways to be creative with how to fund these programs to keep them going.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. Sarah, last words of wisdom, lessons learned.
Yeah, I would say, words of wisdom, really making sure that folks with lived experience and people from the community you're serving are at the core of the design and implementation of your work. you can be data, just raw data, like it's not completely everything. And you need to find out where the conversations about housing instability are naturally occurring in the community to know who those non-traditional partners actually are. And they might be someone that you've never even thought about before. And also just to make sure that when you do involve folks with lived experience, that they are just like well compensated and like involved in an impactful way. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Masita, last words, wisdom?
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback off Sarah because there was a comment in the chat about, how does this help with equity? That's the reason right there, because of the fact of, this first identifies individuals and households that have historically may be marginalized and not have access to resources. So this approach is one of the great ways to be able to ensure that they're not just having the access to resources, but also having the access to improve the system, and coming back and being a part of program evaluations and different things of that nature. So please note that this is a very important. This could be a very key important area of addressing equity within your program. And that's why we're stressing this initiative.
Thank you, Masita. Stephanie, any final words?
Yes. So I think the thing that I've learned the most in this work, specifically around the prevention side, is to look at family member and friend networks as a positive. I know that those are the families we're seeing presenting because they're looking for shelter, but really thinking about it in a holistic way to include those family member and friend networks in the lives of the people that you're serving and utilize them as a support, because as you are trying to address barriers in that individual or family's life, those are the networks of people that are going to support them, so that they don't end up becoming homeless. So I think we found that to be most effective in our prevention program and in our work. So that's
Really great point, Stephanie. Dana, last word.
I'm gonna try to hit 3 points in one short sentence. I think what we've learned most is how important it is to be client-centered in our approach. We're a proactive program and we call people out of the blue. So it's just, we don't have a choice but to be client-centered, right? If we called people up and we were like, here's some money and we want to tell you how to spend it to address your financial concerns and your housing instability, it wouldn't go very well. So it's necessarily a part of our program, but I also think it's a lesson that could be shared with more referral-based prevention programs, is folks know best what resources and assistance they need to help get them into a place of better stability. And I do think that it requires a lot of the ability to be nimble, think creatively, and it requires that your staff is well taken care of and happy and healthy as well. So, we couldn't move as nimbly as we do, think creatively as we do, honor our clients' choice as well as I hope we do, if we didn't have happy case managers who are well taken care of on our team.
Great point. Well, thank you all for those great insights and lessons learned. I think we're all learning in this space. We're truly on a frontier. I'm really excited to be working with the Alliance, just talking about this topic and moving forward. And lastly, I'll just say I'm working with Community Solutions and some of our communities you heard from today on a small learning cohort called the Housing Stabilization Learning Cohort. We have just broadened the invitation to any community who's interested in just walking alongside with us to learn about how to stand up coordinated prevention systems that are targeted. But anyway, lots to learn. I'm going to pass it back to Kay and Marcy, and thank you all.
So Marcy, I'm going to turn it over to you and I'm going to get the slide set back up.
Awesome. All right, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Marcy Thompson, and I'm the Vice President for Programs and Policy here at the Alliance. And I'm excited to be a part of this conversation today and to be able to offer just a few words. at the end of this great conversation. And I think really what you're going to hear me talk about is more of an acknowledgement of some of the things that you already know. As we've been hearing from this panel, it is critical to target our limited homelessness prevention resources as effectively as possible. But let's be honest, while these efforts will certainly be helpful for the households that these resources can reach, even the most effective targeted prevention efforts will be hard pressed to make a real dent in slowing down the inflow that we see today. Homelessness is the symptom of systemic and structural drivers, decades of severely underfunded programs, a worsening affordable housing crisis and growing wage gap, and a healthcare system that is out of reach for far too many, which has led to really a non-existent safety net. And this is resulting in more and more households becoming homeless each year. And let me just say this out loud. Solving these challenges cannot be the responsibility of the homelessness response systems alone. Instead, we need other systems and other partners to think about how what they do, and more importantly, how what they fail to do is resulting in this alarming trend. Recently, I was looking at some data on veterans experiencing homelessness that really demonstrates this story about Inflow. In 2022, in the 2022 point in time count data, there were just over 33,000 veterans experiencing homelessness. In that same year, the VA set an ambitious housing placement goal to house 38,000 veterans, which they beat by housing more than 40,000 veterans. Phenomenal work, a testament to what you all are doing day in and day out. But guess what? In January 2023, there were more than 35,000 veterans reported in the point in time count, which was a 7% increase since the year prior. So this data so clearly demonstrates this point that we're making around Inflow, that while you all are helping more people exit homelessness into housing, an even greater number of people are coming into our systems. So what do we do? Well, we're going to need an all hands on deck effort that looks beyond the homelessness system, beyond the targeted prevention dollars that you all have to work with. We need to kind of think beyond that, do the work. We need the federal government to take meaningful action on the upstream prevention strategies laid out in the federal strategic plan. And by upstream prevention, I mean strategies that really seek to mitigate those structural factors that result in housing instability and homelessness, which could include things like expanding affordable housing, increasing the income of low-income households, and ensuring the availability of and access to healthcare resources to ensure that people don't just have what they need to survive, but to also thrive. It includes making sure that public systems like child welfare and corrections are being accountable to the people in their charge and are taking actions that would decrease the likelihood of homelessness, both immediately upon discharge, but also down the road. Local and state leaders can use that same federal plan as a starting point for upstream prevention strategies to pursue. And homelessness response system folks can inform those efforts by looking at what your own local data can tell them about your inflow. How many people are you housing each year compared to how many people are coming into your system? Where are they coming from? How can that information be used to provide a more accurate picture of what happens when other systems drop the ball? At the Alliance, we're digging in to better understand what short, medium, and long-term federal policy solutions might look like. We're forming new partnerships so that we can have new allies, and this includes all of you. Your voices are the most important ones that Congress wants to hear from. And so I'll just end my rant here by saying, make sure you're signed up to receive alerts about our advocacy efforts at the Take Action page on our website. Reach out to your local, state, and federal lawmakers and use your data to tell the story and demand action. And my team is ready to support your advocacy efforts because we can't do this without you. So thanks for letting me get on a soapbox for a minute, Kay, and I'll hand it over to you to close us out.
So thank you, Marcy. Huge, I get to thank Marcy on a daily basis, but for the rest of you on the panel, thank you so much. So much information. If you all hadn't had a chance to look, the questions were coming in so fast and furious that we have not even had a chance to answer them all. So for all of you that are on the webinar, we will continue to answer questions after the webinar is over. We had a number of staff that were doing their best, but we weren't able to get to everything. And so for all the panelists, thank you, Tom, for moderating, facilitating this discussion. And Masita, Stephanie, Jamie, Dana, and Sarah, like, thanks so much. I don't know, you couldn't see me, but my head was like nodding so much of the time. There's so much to be said. And I think this is a discussion that we're all starting to really wrap our heads around. There's so much to be learned, but what we learned from you today is like amazing. For all of you on the webinar, I've thrown a bunch of these emails already into the Q&A that as people were asking questions. So I'm going to say to our panelists, expect to get emails because people were definitely wanting to talk to a lot of individuals. And so we sent all of that out. Here are everybody's email addresses. We are going to have the slide set will be available after the webinar. And Josh Johnson, who was not on this particular webinar. He was in the background asking questions, but Josh is my colleague who's facilitated all this. So any questions about the series at all, it's there. He's the guy to ask. He's like amazing with this information. And then we have the link will be in the email for the whole series where you can register for the next one. So thank you all. It's 4:30. Thank you all for joining us and staying with us on a late Thursday afternoon for many of us on the East Coast, and for like literally starting at lunchtime for those of you on the West Coast. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And at this point, we're going to end the webinar and we'll see you the next time.